This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
It is Monday, June 9th, 2025. Welcome back to Hang Up and Listen, the sports podcast here at Slate. We're going to go 5 sets with you today. I'm back with you again. I'm Alex Kirshner, a contributing writer here at Slate and co-host of the college football podcast Split Zone Duo. What a weekend in sports that was. We will indeed talk about the French Open, headlined by Carlos Alcaraz beating Jannik Sinner in one of the great matches in Grand Slam history in that 5th set tiebreak that I'm guessing you watched even if you weren't a tennis fan. One of the best matches ever, tennis people are saying. Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs will then talk with Kim Ng, formerly the general manager of the Miami Marlins, a team she got into the postseason, by the way, and now the commissioner of the new Athletes Unlimited Softball League, which right now is opening up play. It's huge times for softball. We'll talk about it. And as the Edmonton Oilers head to Florida for games 3 and 4 of the Stanley Cup Final against the Panthers, we'll have another guest, economist Neil Longley, who has literally written the book on why a Canadian team has not won the Cup in 32 years. I just mentioned her, and as usual, she is joining me this week. Lindsay Gibbs, the publisher of Power Plays, a newsletter covering the key stories of the day in women's sports. Lindsay, have you recovered yet from yesterday's activities at Roland Garros?
Absolutely not. I'm still recovering from the women's final the day before, Coco Gauff beating Arina Sabalenka, and I'm mourning Courtney Vandersloot's torn ACL in the WNBA, so lots of sports feelings.
And of course, just mentioned him too, Ben Lindbergh. You are here. You are a senior editor for The Ringer. You co-host Effectively Wild. How are you?
I often feel as if I'm facing a few championship points myself on a Monday morning, but if Carlos can continue on, then so can we.
Before we get into our business, as always, we want to thank our Slate Plus members for making this show possible. Subscribing helps us make the show. It allows you to get it ad-free, and you also get bonus segments, and we have one of those that is live right now for you. It is about defense, specifically the measurement thereof, and how a new era of stat tracking in baseball has helped us understand the Cubs' Pete Crow Armstrong as not just one of the great players in the game today, but maybe, dare I say, an all-timer? We'll talk about it. You can hear that episode right now as long as you are a Slate Plus member. You can subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visiting slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listened. Carlos Alcaraz was, it appeared, dead in the water. The 22-year-old Spaniard dropped the first 2 sets of the French Open final on Sunday to his rival, the 23-year-old Italian Jannik Sinner. And Sinner had also worked over Alcaraz in the 3rd set, getting himself to championship point before Alcaraz had even really gotten off the mat. In fact, at that moment, Ben just said it, all Sinner had to do was win any of 3 points, and he would have not just won his first title at Roland Garros, he'd have done it in straight sets. Alas, the escape from Alcaraz is full of dangers, and Carlos battled back to win the game and the set and the match, the 5-hour, 29-minute final, the longest that the tournament has ever seen, was an instant classic, with Sinner winning 193 points and Alcaraz winning 192, unfortunately for Sinner, including the last one in a tiebreak in the 5th set. Lindsay, have you ever seen anything quite like that in what has obviously been a pretty golden era for tennis going back 20 years? This really did feel exceptional.
Yeah, it was special. I think normally 5-set matches are overhyped a lot of the times. Like, a lot of times it's really ugly tennis. One's playing well, the other's not, vice versa. There's some, let me just let this set go and save my energy for the next set if you get behind a break or two. This was not that. There was fight from the first game, which I believed lasted over 10 minutes, to the final set tiebreak, in which Alcaraz absolutely dominated, but Sinner didn't play poorly. The story in this match was never about the negatives or the mistakes or the lacking on one side of the net. It was about the excellence that was being brought out on the other. And every time there was a lull, I thought Carlos started very flat. Honestly, I thought the energy in those first two sets was pretty flat overall. But obviously Carlos was able to bring that up, bring the crowd back in. And once he did, Sinner, then question marks were on him. Can he match this energy? He started struggling a little bit physically. Is he going to be okay? And he was. He stepped up. He matched it. He powered it. He was right there. And it was beautiful. It was just a beautiful, beautiful tennis match. And again, I do not believe that all 5 setters are epics, but this was.
Yeah, I literally had in my notes, I'm not sure tennis has ever been played better than that. And I don't know if I've ever seen so many fist pumps in a single sporting event, but they were all justified fist pumps. I was fist pumping, at least in my mind, as I was watching this. And I think the 5-set tennis match in a Grand Slam final is peak sports. I'm not sure that there is a better sporting event than that. Because people always say that baseball is a marathon, not a sprint. A 5-set finals match is both a marathon and a sprint, because these guys literally run a half marathon or so. It's a 5.5 hour test of endurance, but it's also just a display of excellence in short bursts and pressure. And as Lindsay was saying, sometimes it is a slog and both combatants are on their last legs. But here, just a couple of youngins who were still, if not exactly fresh after 5.5 hours, at least still had some zip. I mean, Sinner's 23 and Alcaraz just turned 22, so this might be a different story a decade from now when maybe they'll still be matching up in matches like this. But here, it looked like they could have played forever. So
also, Ben, they never play 5th sets, which makes it even, and Sinner basically never plays them, which makes it even cooler.
Yeah, I mean, I'll hear arguments for hockey overtime or a baseball October rally in the bottom of the 9th or a great golf round on a major Sunday, but I don't know. I don't know that anything can top a 5-set finals match like this. And for the highly anticipated first finals matchup between these two to deliver like that, I mean, the more automatic, consistent Sinner versus the more mercurial but brilliant Alcaraz. It's just a great melding of styles that the only thing that could have made it better maybe is a closer 5th set tiebreak. But even so, the last winner was glorious and just sort of summed up the entire affair. So it was fantastic.
I thought that this match also drew strength from the clear hero versus villain dynamic in the building. Jannik Sinner, as we talked about with Ben Rothenberg recently came off a 3-month doping suspension. And some people in tennis feel it was a little light and a little bit designed so that he could be back for this tournament. I'm not used to seeing in tennis such a clear dichotomy of who's being rooted for and who's being rooted against in the building. But I mean, this crowd was, Lindsay, 97% Carlos. And they weren't booing Sinner. They appreciated his contributions. This is still tennis, not a Philadelphia Eagles game. But it did feel like our hero was out there doing heroic things against the villain. And that added something too. Sports can use characters.
Yeah, I think narratives are juicy in this one. I don't know if I agree with you. I mean, Nadal at the French Open was, the way the crowd supported him.
King
of
course,
clay. The king of clay. Mm-hmm. And I think Alcaraz, obviously being from Spain as well, there's so much of he almost inherited that throne very quickly.
I guess what I'm really talking about is against Sinner.
Okay, for sure.
Not loving.
Stylistically, too, there's a little like Nadal versus Djokovic to them because Sinner's just so not robotic exactly, but he just seems smooth, unflustered, whereas Alcaraz, he's just so creative, like it could go wrong at any second, but also he will just do things on a tennis court that no one else ever does. And so it's a little bit more of a high wire act, but the moments of brilliance are just better than anyone else's. So they were both kind of playing to the crowd, and the crowd was appreciating what both of them were bringing. But yes, it was clearly a pro Carlos crowd.
Yeah. No doubt about that.
Yeah. And I think it's amazing also that there's this intrigue to this rivalry because, I mean, they're off to incredible starts and Alcaraz is now on track to be the year-end number one, even though nobody but Alcaraz can beat Sinner at this point. But they have the same number of combined majors, 8, that Nadal and Djokovic had at the same age, and they've combined to win the last 6 now. So Djokovic, who lost to Sinner in the semis, he's still a top 5 player, but he'll join Nadal and Federer in retirement soon enough. So this is clearly Alcaraz's and Sinner's sport now. And I know that this match wasn't quite as long as some of those Nadal-Djokovic battles, but it was just as memorable. And that kind of amazes me because for a long time, tennis has been about the big three, not only competing against each other, but also competing against the all-time greats and just climbing that leaderboard and eventually getting to the top of it, which was Serena's quest too. And so it was kind of deflating for Federer and Nadal and Serena to retire because it was like, well, when are we going to see someone challenge their records? Even if someone amazing comes along, it'll take years and years for anyone to get into that territory. And Sinner and Alcaraz are very far from that all-time territory, yet their rivalry already feels similarly special.
Yeah, and I didn't know if we were ever going to be able to capture the fan base's engagements for the Federer, Nadal, Djokovic in the men's tennis again because of how special it was the way that formed, right? With Federer's dominance and elegance really capturing a certain level of fan, and then Nadal coming in as that clear, like, absolute opposite to that. And then Djokovic coming in as like the ultimate heel and all three of them dominating for a decade. Plus, it was just so special. And it's been really fun to watch the Sinner versus Alcaraz rivalry develop as well. And it doesn't seem quite as toxic as some of the Djokovic versus Nadal versus Federer fan bases could be. And I appreciate that too. It's fun.
And we probably would be talking more about the women's final if this hadn't been just an absolute all-timer. But the contrast between those finals was fairly strong just in terms of the post-match quotes and the crispness of the play. We talked about Madison Keys upsetting Sabalenka in Australia, and something similar happened here with Coco Gauff. And you know, Sabalenka made 70 unforced errors in the final, and there was a lot of wind, and it was partly down to the conditions, but she was not gracious in defeat, I would say.
No.
She said this about Gauff. She was hitting the ball from the frame. Somehow, magically, the ball lands in the court. It felt like a joke, like somebody from above was just staying there laughing, like, let's see if you can handle this. She won the match not because she played incredible, just because I made all of those mistakes. And she also emphasized how bad she had been against Gauff at the U.S. Open final a couple of years ago. So not only was it a better match, I mean, there's something to that. She wasn't at the top of her game in this match the way that both Sinner and Alcaraz were, but just the sportsmanship on display after the men's final and the fact that they were both sort of saluting each other and recognizing that they're bringing out the best in each other, as opposed to Sabalenka essentially saying, she didn't beat me, I beat myself.
Yeah. I would love to have been a fly on the wall when Sabalenka's publicist I have to imagine, just had an unbelievable crisis and then drafted an Instagram story apology for her like a day later. Much more gracious in the written statement a day later. Never where you want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, listen, I loved this women's final. I have to just want to bring up the Afterball I did a few weeks ago at the start of this tournament, where we went into how women have been systemically kind of locked out of these 5-set thrillers by the establishment. And I do think that's part of my hesitancy to go all out gushing about 5-setters, is because this is, this format is being kept from the women's game. And I can't separate that, right, from like my love for women's tennis and men's tennis. But it's hard to ignore. A special thing though about the 3-set format in the final is how intense it is from the very beginning. And the this final between Coco and Aryna I thought it was thrilling. I absolutely loved it. For Aryna to start off so strong, for Coco to turn that first set around, force a tiebreaker, but then Aryna to dominate that tiebreaker and Coco not to go completely away mentally. Absolutely phenomenal. And yeah, Aryna was being childish at the end of this and really, really ungrateful and ungraceful. And I don't hate it, but she deserves hate for it, if that makes sense. Like
100%.
Yeah.
I hope she gets booed off the court at the U.S. Open.
But I also love
there.
it because it's authentic to her and how she was feeling at the time. So I support her right to be an ungrateful, loser, and also support the right for everyone to be pissed at her for being that. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. It does. Can I ask, so at the U.S. Open last year, around that time, we talked on this show about how that looked like a potential breakthrough moment on both the men's and women's sides of the tournament for the Stars and Stripes to kind of stake a new claim after not a great few years in the slams. And it has not happened with the men, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen because I'm not sure who's going to win any Grand Slams other than those two guys. But this is 2 in a row for us with Madison Keys and with Coco Gauff to start the 2025 Slam season. Would we read anything much into that as far as the themes we were talking about last year about the development of American players? Or is it just that, we've had some really good Americans who have been in the mix with the great players from the rest of the world, and finally you get 2 in a row here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that women's tennis in the United States has been and is in a great place. I think I just don't think it can be overstated the impact that Serena and Venus Williams had, and to see it not only be back-to-back American women, but back-to-back Black American women winning these Grand Slams, it's remarkable. And both of them, both Madison and Coco, directly influenced by Serena and Venus. And, we had Sloane Stephens doing a lot of the commentary on TNT, another Black American who's won a Grand Slam. So it's special and it means something. But I think what this proved is that Coco Gauff, we talk about the big 2 in women's tennis being Iga Swiatek and Aryna Sabalenka. We did get to see them finally meet in a Grand Slam when they met in the semifinals, which was 2 phenomenal sets, and then Aryna just running away with it in the 3rd set. And but I think this proves that Coco Gauff is right up there with them. And I think it's interesting because for me, Aryna was a lot more gracious when she lost to Madison Keys. And I think it's because she understands Madison Keys' game, right? Her game and Madison Keys have a very similar game. And she could see that Madison Keys just hit this stratosphere of big hitting, winner, go for broke, women, aggressive, offensive tennis. And there was Aryna could kind of feel like she couldn't do anything about it. Whereas Coco's brand of tennis gets under Sabalenka's skin because Sabalenka just fundamentally doesn't understand this level of tennis, which is, I think, very compelling, but not always the most aesthetically pleasing. And it is a lot about digging into the game of your player. And you're not taking the racket out of her hand the way Madison Keys does, but you're messing up what's coming off of her racket. You're messing up the timing. You're just tinkering with her timing enough that she is hitting 70 unforced errors. I don't think it's anything that Sabalenka can understand. And I think the fact that Coco has done this to her in 2 Grand Slam finals contributes to the way that Sabalenka is just over Coco Gauff. And again, Sabalenka deserves all the criticism for the way she's going about, the way she reacted to Coco Gauff. But I think she's just like flabbergasted by this.
Or maybe it was just the wind or some cruel god looking down and laughing at Sabalenka. But yeah, Coco was the first American woman to win the French since Serena a decade ago. So it had been a while. Just a very satisfying tennis weekend all around. Good sport.
I'm a fan.
Yeah, the competition was just top class. And I think you're right that it's more head to head than even like great match play in golf, where unless you're playing head games, you're not really competing with each other in the same way you are in tennis. Like, I can't make you hit a bad shot the way that you just described in tennis. It was very cool stuff.
2 of the semifinal losses, we saw Djokovic lose. This might have been his last French Open. And I felt like because he played well against Sinner, but Sinner was so good, there was a humility and an acceptance to Djokovic leaving the stage that I really haven't seen before. Like, almost like, yeah, I lost to someone better than me on this day, and maybe it really is time to pass the torch. There was a kind of a beauty in the way he left that court that day. And also it was good to see Swiatek a little bit back to herself. But I mean, this is her losing at the French Open. That should be a headline story. It's kind of wild that it wasn't. Because of how poorly she's played lately. So I'm really curious to see how she bounces back the rest of the season and if she can recapture any of that top level form.
Up next, I will pass the torch for one segment while Ben and Lindsay ask some softball questions, if I may. As we progress through the season, every fan knows that big wins are hard to come by and tough losses are even harder to accept. But do you know what isn't hard to accept? Discover. Believe it or not, Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. You heard that right. 99%. So make a good call for your wallet and get Discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard. This episode is sponsored by the San Diego State University Sports MBA program. SDSU's Sports MBA is a full-time, in-person graduate program that trains students for sports business roles with team front offices, agencies, venues, brands, and more. The program's curriculum includes all of the quantitative coursework of a typical MBA, but adds a sports focus with themes familiar to regular Hang-Up listeners, such as the growth of women's sports, labor relations, athletes' rights, and social responsibility. SDSU Sports MBA students even spend a week studying abroad in the Dominican Republic to learn about the many ways Major League Baseball's presence impacts the country. Throughout their studies, students serve as interns, consultants, and part-time employees with sports organizations across Southern California, including the San Diego Padres. Applications are currently being accepted through July 1st for an August 2025 start. Visit sdsu.edu/hangup to learn more and apply. That's sdsu.edu/hangup.
Well, the Texas Longhorns beat Texas Tech on Friday to win the Women's College World Series in 3 games. In the third game, they chased Tech's two-way star, NiJaree Canady, after 8 batters. Canady had thrown 48 straight innings for the Red Raiders before finally running out of gas, and her heroics propelled her team to within 1 win of a title 2 years after it finished last in the Big 12. She also propelled herself to a second $1 million NIL deal. The junior will be back with Texas Tech next season, but had she come along a little earlier, her professional future beyond that would have been in doubt. Now, that may not be the case thanks to the Athletes Unlimited Softball League, which is trying to provide the pro path that softball has lacked in this country of late. On Saturday, with the World Series over and the NBA and NHL off, the AUSL filled the finals void with the opener of its inaugural season, which featured the Blaze and the Volt, 2 of its 4 current barnstorming teams. That game was broadcast on MLB Network and streamed on MLB TV in the wake of a strategic investment by Major League Baseball in the AUSL, which was announced late last month. Joining us now is one of the people who's trying to make sure that investment pays off as she oversees the AUSL's transition to a city-based format next year. Kim Eng is a former senior vice president of baseball operations for Major League Baseball and a former high-ranking executive for multiple MLB teams, including the Miami Marlins, with whom she served as general manager from late 2020 to late 2023. She was also the captain and MVP of the University of Chicago Maroons softball team, which prepared her well for all the ceremonial first pitches she could be called upon to throw out as the AUSL's new commissioner. Kim, for years you worked for commissioners. Have you gotten used to being called commissioner?
Not at all. And I will never get used to that title whatsoever.
Well, why did you and the founders of the league, as well as MLB, see such an opportunity here for AUSL? Has the softball interest not been mined to this point? Do you think there is greater interest than there has been? Why do you believe in the prospects for this league's success?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Really appreciate it. So I think, all you have to do is look at the college metrics that we've seen. And now they really are, they're not one-offs. They are clearly a trend, and they've been a trend for a number of years. Spiking with, I will say, a record viewership for the College World Series in Game 3 and Game 2. I think it was 3.1 million, whereas the previous high the year before was 2.1. Oklahoma was going for its fourth straight. So I think that in and of itself, that one number is definitely something to point to. But like I said, this has really been a trend for a good period of time. We're seeing year over year increases in the College World Series viewership, year over year increases in terms of attendance. They built another deck at Devon Park where the College World Series is played. And then I think if you go lower down in the softball pipeline, you'll see that between baseball and softball players ages 6 through 12, there's a 27% increase in the last 5 years. So all of that leads you to believe that softball is very well positioned to take advantage of what we've seen in the last several years on the women's sports landscape. On that front. And, obviously in the wake of Caitlin Clark, what the WNBA is doing, we just actually went to the Sky Fever game while we were here in Chicago, which was awesome. And so for someone who lived in Chicago years ago, having seen the Bulls play at the United Center, and now to see the Chicago Sky playing in the United Center and packed to the gills, I think the attendance was 20,000 or so. That is incredibly, heartening for me, and just an incredible sign of where we are today.
That's so special. So for those of our listeners who aren't familiar, Athletes Unlimited has been around for 5-6 years at this point. They have leagues in multiple sports, from volleyball to softball to basketball to lacrosse. Many I'm forgetting. But the typical Athletes Unlimited setup is kind of a in real life fantasy sports combination where everyone's playing at one site. You get points based on how your team performs and how you perform as an individual. The teams are redrafted every single week, and there is an individual champion crowned at the end. So there aren't these team names and team entities to kind of follow throughout a season. Were you familiar with this Athletes Unlimited world? I mean, softball, I think, was the first sport they got into, and they had a big impact there. Were you familiar with what they were doing before you took this job? But also, how is this transition from that kind of upstart barnstorming model that was kind of looking to disrupt the system? How is that transition from that to the more traditional team sport system going?
Yeah, so I met John and Jonathan as they were about to launch their softball league 6 years ago.
They're the founders of Athletes Unlimited.
Co-founders of Athletes Unlimited. And so I loved what they had to say. I loved their values. They have built a very values-driven organization. And I thought what they were doing was actually very smart, very innovative. We had studied why previous iterations of this softball model had not succeeded, had failed. And so the idea of a league staying in one place where you're taking out a lot of the expenses, some of them unnecessary expenses through travel, accommodations, et cetera, housing them all in one place, housing the athletes all in one place, and then trying to connect with the fans, because in previous iterations, it was very much like Major League Baseball, where you had city-based teams that had not caught on, and they were living hand to mouth. So again, taking out those expenses and having fans connect to athletes and really trying to help athletes build their brand, I thought was a really interesting way of going about it. And so I think, and I admire them and respect them for having done their homework on previous leagues and trying to figure out what type of platform would work in this case. So they did that for 5 years. I think they heard the athletes loud and clear. I think the athletes missed some of that team camaraderie and the consistency of being with a team over a number of months. And so I wouldn't say pivoted, but they actually added this new version of the league, and we actually are going to keep the previous version and we've rebranded it the All-Star Cup. That will take place in August. So I am very familiar with it. I thought it was really innovative. I still do. Anytime you have change, I think it takes time. I think it takes a lot of time for people to understand why and to get used to it. It's been fun for me having gotten to know the athletes and talking to them more. And when I ask them about Athletes Unlimited, they say, we use that format in practice sometime. So that's where I think it has gone. Is it's taken it. It's gone to a different market. And I think the more popular it gets and the more, people try and spice up their practices and their game format, scrimmage format, I think then it might be, you'll see more growth on the pro side.
And Athletes Unlimited owns the league and its teams, so this is a very different structure from MLB's or a lot of other sports leagues. What challenges does that pose and what opportunities does it present? I'm sure that there were times when you were working at the MLB commissioner's office when it would have been nice to just be able to make some change because you just had the say and didn't have to have other owners approve that. So does that make things easier to engineer a league the way that you're trying to do?
Yes, and having had to watch Commissioner Seelig and Commissioner Manfred navigate that was great learnings for me, and happy that I don't necessarily have to do it here, because I do think that the single owner entity that we are is very much a great model for now, and especially when you're building a league and creating that foundation. I think you have to be nimble, you have to be flexible, and ready to move quickly based on learnings. And I think to gather consensus and to educate, it takes time and it takes effort. Whereas if you only have, a couple of people that you need to, have agree with you, I think that's obviously a much more palatable situation when you're trying to grow quickly.
Only 4 teams this first season, which it seems like had a very successful opening weekend with sold out games, and the television contract is just great. I love that I can go to MLB.com and read recaps of the games and, kind of find reporting on it. It's phenomenal. But why these 4 teams and kind of not going, you're switching to the team models, but we're not seeing cities attached to the teams quite yet? Is that in the future?
It is in the plan. So, yeah, obviously, when you're starting up a league, there are learnings to be had.
Yeah.
Despite how much you've reviewed and studied and talked to folks, the landscape is different than it was 5 years ago, obviously. I mean, we're seeing
Mm.
that. And so, again, to maintain that flexibility, that nimbleness, I think, you don't want to grow too quickly. You don't want to start off too big. And so I think the 4 teams, we knew how to handle 60 athletes. That's what we've been in the past. And so just making sure that, we build that foundation. But in terms of expansion, our plan is for in 2026, next year, that we will have 6 teams. And based on the 12 markets that we'll be traveling to this summer, we'll be able to pick 6 cities to then attach those 6 teams to. So, yeah. And then after that, in terms of expansion, obviously we need to see how cities and markets react, fan bases and how quickly they build. So hopefully, we can get to 8 in the near future, but we obviously have to make sure that we approach methodically and with intention.
That's so exciting. And how is I haven't seen much reporting on this, and maybe that's intentional, but, as someone who reports on women's sports, the salaries and salary caps and player resources, how is that being figured out? Is this a model where kind of some leagues, everyone kind of gets paid the same thing to start off with? And I know Athletes Unlimited has done that in the past. And then with bonuses, are players able to negotiate their contracts? Is there a salary cap in place? How is that structured?
Yeah, so we basically have a system where we have a salary minimum as well as a salary maximum for the regular season. And then the players get a bonus for being named to the All-Star Cup. And then within the All-Star Cup, they have the ability to then earn more money on top of all that if they earn performance bonuses. So it's very much that Athletes Unlimited structure from before added on to what we would probably term more of a normal salary structure.
What are the ranges? Like, are these livable wages? I know that's something that Athletes Unlimited has really prided itself on in the past.
So our average is about 40,000.
Okay.
And so, so
for 2 months, that's really good.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's our average. And then on top of that, some of the things that we're really proud of, this past off season, we added year-round health coverage.
Wow.
An absolute first in softball. So really proud to do that. And then, we have just these incredible benefits from our pregnancy policy to our child care policy. We have several moms who are part of our athlete core who, they'll have their little ones traveling with us for part of the season. And so, those are some of the items that we're really proud of. In addition, we give them health club memberships so that they can work out during the off season, access to batting facilities during the off season. So all of these things that, we tried to address when the athletes have asked for it.
ESPN and Sports Illustrated reported that MLB's investment was an 8-figure one for more than a 20% stake in the AOSL. Are the salaries and benefits that we're talking about the proceeds of investments like that? Are these things that money can buy for your league? Or is that partnership, from your perspective, more about what that money can't buy or that no money can buy that this partnership brings in terms of exposure, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't know that we can just categorize it either or. Here's what I will tell you is that, Athletes Unlimited, and this is one of the big reasons that I was very much attracted to the organization and to the ethos that John Patricoff and Jonathan Soros have tried to build and cultivate, is that they very much have the athletes in mind, and that with the growth of Athletes Unlimited, again, we are in the process of setting the foundation, but as Athletes Unlimited grows, the athletes will prosper. And that that growth will trickle down to the athletes as well. One thing I didn't mention was the profit participation units that athletes receive over 20 years. Obviously, we've got to get to profitability, and that is very much top of mind. But when we get there, the athletes will participate in that.
Have you studied the history of professional softball in the U.S. as a way of learning what not to do or what could potentially be improved upon? There have been leagues like National Pro Fast Pitch, formerly the Women's Pro Softball League, that tried to make a go of it and were around for years off and on, but never really were able to offer a living wage, and players, Japan was more of a lucrative market, but it's been very difficult to establish a league like that here. So is it that the time wasn't ripe and now it is, or do you think that there are things structurally, organizationally that you can do that maybe those leagues weren't able to do?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons and quite a few learnings that John and Jonathan and me, having been at Major League Baseball, wanting to help in this arena, have done and reviewed. So we take those learnings and we apply them here. I think that the time is certainly different, in that. Yeah, well, first of all, the women's landscape is obviously very different, very different than just a couple of years ago, several years ago. I think that's number one. Number two, I think that the platforms that we have now are much more helpful in raising awareness. So, for example, social media and being able to measure avidity amongst a group, right? So you have all your social metrics, you have all your engagements and impressions, and those numbers are now, able to be taken to potential partners and sponsors. And so I think the savviness has gotten greater in terms of the people, of this league and who are running it, obviously learning on the heels of, at the expense of the other leagues. But I just think there's a lot more information and knowledge about how to build this business. And then you factor in the investment from an MLB, all of their institutional knowledge, their fan base, their network, their sponsors, their platforms, and you just get to a very different outlook. So we're incredibly excited about all of that.
Because you come from both a baseball background and, to some extent, a softball background, I wonder how you regard women's baseball. The Women's Pro Baseball League is scheduled to launch next year. Do you see that league or women's baseball in general as a complement or competition? Can women's baseball and softball coexist peacefully or even help each other out in some ways? Or are they inevitably sort of fighting for the same pool of talent?
It's so interesting, having been on the men's side and now having come over to the women's side. The one thing that I have been incredibly struck by is the collaboration on the women's side, and so that involves us calling what many would consider our competition. So Love Volleyball, we've called Unrivaled, WNBA, NWSL, so all in the same stratosphere, but we have all helped each other in terms of learnings. I'm sorry, PWHL is someone that we've leaned very hard on. They are also a single owner entity, so I think that there's room in the space for everyone. I think this is just such an untapped, now recognizable market, that there's space for everyone.
And you alluded to Caitlin Clark earlier. Of course, everyone refers to the Caitlin Clark effect. And now people are starting to talk about the NiJaree Canady effect. And perhaps it's premature to talk about her future potentially in AUSL, given that she is still in school. But I wonder whether you think that a player like that who can capture people's imaginations and make many new converts in the way that Caitlin Clark has, what effect that could have potentially on a fledgling league.
An incredible effect. I mean, like you said, all you have to do is look at Caitlin Clark and understand like how impactful. And it's Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, and I think just a spotlight on all of the incredible athleticism, right? So it was Caitlin Clark in the college realm, but then she came to the WNBA, and everyone gets uplifted between and then the rivalries are created, and so I think that. In terms of NiJaree, I mean, she has definitely captured imaginations and hearts and minds. And so, as you project forward, absolutely, she could have a really great effect on a league.
And lastly, you wrote your senior thesis in college on Title IX, and I wonder, when you look at the landscape of women's sports and all the growth that we've been talking about during this segment, amateur and pro, do you think this is what I envisioned when I was writing that thesis, or this has taken longer than I expected, or this has exceeded my expectations?
I think it's I don't know about exceeded yet. I think Title IX, was about opportunity, right? And making sure that everyone had equal opportunity. I would think what we're seeing now is that everyone understands that this is, being in and watching women's sports is just great business, period. Right? It's just incredible business. I mean, and one of the striking statements that I heard at a conference was, you might not want to do many long-term contracts in women's sports because, this thing could absolutely explode and just take off. So with that in mind, again, women's sports is just great business, period.
Well, we thank you so much for your time, and we wish you luck in adjusting to people calling you commissioner and also to actually being commissioner. And if you can take the Marlins to the playoffs, then I will not bet against you in any endeavor. So thank you very much, Kim.
Thank you, all.
Thank you, Kim.
Hey, bye-bye.
All right. It will not be hockey night in Canada again until Saturday, but will it be a Stanley Cup victory for Canada? We shall see. We shall also discuss why it hasn't been for so long and what the Canadian Stanley Cup drought represents for the evolution of hockey in Canada. We will be rejoined by Alex Kirshner and a new guest after this break.
As we progress through the season, every fan knows that big wins are hard to come by and tough losses are even harder to accept. But do you know what isn't hard to accept? Discover. Believe it or not, Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. You heard that right. 99%. So make a good call for your wallet and get Discover. Based on the February 2024 Nielsen report. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard. This episode is sponsored by the San Diego State University Sports MBA program. SDSU's Sports MBA is a full-time, in-person graduate program that trains students for sports business roles with team front offices, agencies, venues, brands, and more. The program's curriculum includes all of the quantitative coursework of a typical MBA, but adds a sports focus with themes familiar to regular Hang-Up listeners, such as the growth of women's sports, labor relations, athletes' rights, and social responsibility. SDSU Sports MBA students even spend a week studying abroad in the Dominican Republic to learn about the many ways Major League Baseball's presence impacts the country. Throughout their studies, students serve as interns, consultants, and part-time employees with sports organizations across Southern California, including the San Diego Padres. Applications are currently being accepted through July 1st for an August 2025 start. Visit sdsu.edu/hangup to learn more and apply. That's sdsu.edu/hangup.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game, shifting a little money here, a little there, just hoping it all works out? Well, With the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can be a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill, too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll help you find options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
The Edmonton Oilers are in the midst of a Stanley Cup final rematch with the Florida Panthers, a series that may or may not wrap up by the next time Hang Up records an episode. I'm guessing not, given the couple of overtime games to get started. Feels like this is going to go longer than 5 games. But I hope that it does, because that would be a lot of fun. It's also a long time coming for a team from Canada to win the sport's ultimate prize. In June of 1993, I was not even conceived yet, and the Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cup. I have not lived to see another Canadian team, or the Canadiens for that matter, hoist Lord Stanley. There are now 7 out of the 32 NHL teams playing north of the border, and they have come up empty for 3 decades and change. Everyone's got a theory about why Canadian teams have come up empty for 32 years, but most people haven't literally written a book about it. Our next guest has. Neil Longley is Professor Emeritus in the Eisenberg School of Management at UMass Amherst, and he's the author of the book A Whole New Game, Economics, Politics, and the Transformation of the Business of Hockey in Canada. Neil, it's great to see you. You believe that Canada has lost a sort of grip that it once had on this sport, and you see the cup drought as a manifestation of that. So when you write about the sellout of a sport that Canada once dominated to big money U.S. corporatization, what are you driving at, and how does that connect to Canadian teams' inability to win this trophy?
Well, thanks for having me on, everyone. And Alex, I think for me, the issue starts back at about the time of the last Canadian-based club winning the Stanley Cup in 1993, as you had said. And up until that point, the economic power really of the league resided in Canada. If you looked at revenue generation ability, you had the clubs up there like the Canadiens, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and so on that were the drivers of the revenue of the sport. I'm an economist, so that's really the perspective I take. But during the 90s, the economics of the NHL fundamentally changed. And there were several factors that went into that. One of them that I point out in the book is the digital world and the ability of a large market U.S.-based teams to more fully capitalize on their huge population advantage over most of the Canadian markets. And so we saw during the 90s revenues differences amongst the NHL clubs explode. So we from relatively small gaps, we seen, the Rangers and the Red Wings back in that era, they're all of a sudden had double the revenues of some of the smaller Canadian market teams. There was no salary cap back in that era. This was much more of a baseball style market. So that divergence really had its origins during the 90s. Some other factors that went into that as well. So we saw during the 90s a massive economic struggling of the Canadian franchises. That was one of them. They couldn't keep up on the ice. This was a free market, no payroll constraints. They were losing that battle. We saw the value of the Canadian dollar plummet, which is really critical in the NHL because Canadian clubs pay salaries in US dollars, but they generally earn revenues in Canadian dollars. So a low value of the Canadian dollar really sharply disadvantages Canadian teams. And I think the other thing is that we saw the beginning of really a new strategic era in the NHL with the arrival of Gary Bettman from the NBA. He had a mission to really put the NHL on a national footprint in the U.S. and was very concerned about, markets in places that were going to draw network TV contracts. So you needed clubs in places like Phoenix and Dallas and so on that were large markets, even though they may not have had the strong hockey following. So I think those things combine. And, Alex, you mentioned that 7 out of the 32 clubs right now are based in Canada. Back in 1993, Canada had 8 clubs out of 24 in the NHL. So from pure math, we know that there's going to be less of an odds. That kind of got fixed in 2005, the payroll differences with the hard cap. But it seems so what has happened since then is somewhat harder to explain.
Was there a possible scenario where a Canadian domestic league could have developed and become dominant? Is the main obstacle to that, as you noted, the small population, just not enough people to support the balance of power being north of the border?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely something, Ben, that I look at in the book. And I think to some extent by that point, the proverbial ship had sailed. I think if that was going to happen, it probably would have had to have happened decades earlier. And the NHL had very far reaches into the Canadian amateur hockey system, has for 100 years basically. So all of the so-called major junior clubs in one era were controlled by NHL clubs. So it was very hard for, let's say, entrepreneurs to have an independent league, independent of the NHL. But yeah, that's something that I think may have changed the game. But at a certain point, things get too far along to be able to really make that kind of a radical change. The other thing about Canada is most of the population lives within 100 miles or so of the U.S. border, but it's spread out over 4,000 miles-ish east to west. So in that era too, travel would become difficult and so on. But it is a curiosity to me how, with hockey being so important in Canada, there wasn't more of an independent league that developed.
One thing that interests me about this is recruiting. I know free agency is a big part of all sports now, and obviously there's a salary cap and the talent's going to go somewhere. There are rules, like every team is going to have talent, but is it too simple to say that the biggest stars just want to play in warm weather markets and be places that, have a beach? Is that, we hear like that a lot in the NBA. But also I know, we're talking about, the Oilers right now, and it seems like that team has had a lot of investment as far as like practice facilities and resources for players. So is that something that the Canadian teams can do to kind of even things out a little bit? Yeah,
I think so, Lindsay. And I think, they're not really new, but the newish ownership group there that has made some large investments. They have a relatively new arena. So these things definitely do help. And I think, obviously landing Draisaitl and Connor McDavid 10-ish years ago has definitely helped. But I do think that is a factor. And I think your broader point about the ability to attract and retain free agents also matters. And even in a salary cap era, we do know that players often make choices for reasons beyond that. Winning cultures, sort of what we call the non-pecuniary benefits, the issues outside of just pure money. But I think if you look at, the Oilers' rival in Alberta, the Calgary Flames, I mean, they were building a strong contender. The late Johnny Gaudreau, he left the Flames to sign for less with Columbus. Matthew Tkachuk, now obviously of the Panthers, was probably not going to re-sign there. So that is a very real issue. And I think sometimes it's subtle, but the ability to keep free agents, and it is, the Warren Beach, or at least not 40 below in the winter. And I think there's still some middle ground. The tax structures are different. So hard salary caps cannot really equalize that. Players may still make decisions for other reasons than pure salary. And I think that's potentially a disadvantage for some of the, prairie teams and the Canadian prairies like Winnipeg, Calgary, and Edmonton.
I think we have to talk about the least prairie Canadian team when we're talking about this, which is the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Leafs, I think, are interesting here because they are a big, glitzy market. Toronto is a financial capital. It is a cultural capital, a wonderful, diverse city with several major professional sports teams. And yet I think it's striking not only that, of course, the Leafs haven't won a Stanley Cup since 1967. You can just say 1967 in hockey and everyone knows what you're talking about. But also that players seem to some extent, look down upon playing in Toronto. And Toronto is sort of viewed as a city where you'll get a media circus that isn't pleasant for players in kind of the same way that New York is sometimes talked about in the United States. But this was happening after the Panthers knocked out the Leafs in the playoffs this year. You had multiple Panthers just taking pot shots on the podcast circuit or the post-game press conference circuit about how good the Leafs would be if only Toronto could be a little bit more hospitable to their hockey team. And of course, there's now talk that Mitch Marner, one of the best players in hockey who plays for the Leafs, is probably going to leave for somewhere warm. Would some of this be solved if the Leafs were simply run better and or the Canadiens were simply run better, the two that are, Eastern time zone major cities that don't seem like they should be unattractive destinations?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. So the part here that we haven't spoken about until now is management of the club. How well do you draft? How well do you make other player personnel decisions? And those clubs, have struggled over the years. The Leafs, got Austin Matthews, and I think that was supposedly seen as being, a changer. And I do think that, as you call them, the media circus, I think that has been often a factor for players coming to any Canadian city. They cannot be anonymous. They cannot be anonymous in those cities. And for some players, they want to be anonymous. I remember Roberto Luongo back for the Vancouver Canucks, 2011 Stanley Cup against the Bruins. And he talked about in Vancouver, he couldn't really go out in public without being in a disguise and this kind of thing. And maybe for some players, they love the media circus, but for others, they want to be much more anonymous in a market where hockey players aren't as easily recognizable. But yes, I do think management matters. I relay in the book as well with the Oilers and the Flames some of the very bad draft decisions they made for a long, long time. Toronto's an interesting market. It's hard to explain. It's hard to explain why that club can never, kind of get over the hump. And I think this year, in fairness, they probably had a club that could have gone further than it did. But we know also in the playoffs, short series, there's a random element. And sometimes we talk about success, I know as economists, just in terms of thinking about who won the championship, but there's a lot other measures. There's still one of 32. But Toronto and Montreal should be better consistently than they are, based on the economics of the game. Yes.
I was going to say, you could say they could have won about any number of Leafs teams over the years. And partly this is just a product of chance, and Edmonton could have easily ended this drought last year. So it's partly reflective of these underlying factors and partly just pucks not going in when they could have. But I wonder whether this has redounded to the benefit of hockey at large. You have written and talked about how the Winnipeg Jets of the World Hockey Association in the early 70s, they started importing players from Europe who were faster and higher scoring, and that brand of hockey appealed to U.S. audiences and maybe enhanced its popularity in this country. So is it better for hockey that things have evolved the way that they have, even if it's worse for Canadian hockey?
Right. And I think it's definitely true. I think the business of hockey, or the business of the NHL, if we want to call it that, has been very successful over the past 30 years. And the Gary Bettman era has done a lot for the NHL. Again, the national footprint in the U.S. We're now seeing, some of the things I study too is player origins. We're now seeing what I would call a second major shift in player origins. And as you said, Ben, the first was the Europeans way back, but we're seeing a substantial increase, even over the last decade, in the number of American players in the NHL. So I can certainly see the day when the number of Americans in the NHL will exceed the number of Canadians. I'm not sure that's too far off. So the interest in the game across the continent. We saw the four nations face off and some of the interest it generated there. Obviously, a lot of interest in Canada, but even pretty significant interest here in the U.S. So I think it is good for the game. It's certainly good for the owners. It's certainly good for the players. And I think in general, it's good for all hockey fans. And, the Canadian issue, I think, because it's gone on for so long with the Stanley Cup drought, has become a talking point. But I'm not sure that really is the key issue. Like we said, that drought could have been broken a long time ago. The first year after we had the cap, 2006, the Oilers lost in Game 7. We had Ottawa the next year. So we've had multiple possible stoppages of that drought when we wouldn't be talking about this today, probably, had that happened.
Has it become, though, a little bit of a almost a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, how much is this in the brains of Canadians or, Canadian hockey players? Right. I mean, I even look at I cover women's sports, and even looking at the PWHL, the first 2 seasons, the best team in the regular season was a team from Canada, which of course has half of the teams. And then Minnesota comes out of nowhere and wins wins the Walter Cup both seasons. So, it hasn't even had a league that's very much bolstered by Canada as well, has still not had a chance. Like, is this kind of in the brains of Canadians? Is this something that bothers people?
I just sort of as a disclaimer, I haven't lived in Canada for almost a quarter century, even though I am Canadian. But back in those days, I don't think Canadians cared about whether it was a US based team or a Canadian based team. It was a very different environment. The sense I get now, I think, because of this drought, is that, let's say a Calgary Flames fan will hope the Oilers win the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
And it's like 25, 30, 40 years ago, that would have been impossible. Having lived in Alberta during that time, that simply would never have happened. So I think now we're seeing Canadians rally around Canadian-based clubs, even though the makeup of those Canadian-based clubs in terms of player origins is basically identical to every other club on the league. The Golden Knights here in Vegas have done a wonderful job promoting the game, promoting the NHL, but they're probably the most Canadian club in terms of players of any club in the National Hockey League. So for me, and again, this is an economist speaking, that whole a club is Canadian raises questions as to how we're seeing Canadian. The four nations face-off was clearly Canada and the U.S. The Oilers, Panthers, obviously many Canadian fans are seeing it that way. I'm not I don't study fan psychology, so I can't say why, but I think it's a question I've had. I know I was up in the Vancouver area last year at this time, and there were a lot of people there that were cheering for the Oilers.
I can confirm, having just been in Vancouver for a wedding a few weeks ago, I heard this exact sentiment.
Yeah.
So I don't think you're wrong at all.
And again, back in the so-called old days, that would have not happened.
No, I imagine that it would not have. Professor, thank you so much for coming on the show. He is Neil Longley. He is the author of A Whole New Game, Economics, Politics, and the Transformation of the Business of Hockey in Canada. You can find it wherever you find books. Neil, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to everyone.
Lindsay, I believe it is Afterball time.
Thank you, Alex. As we have mentioned, Texas won its first ever NCAA softball championship over this weekend. It was not an easy road to the championship. The Longhorns were swept by Oklahoma in the championship series in 2022 and 2024 in the Women's College World Series. Although they were preseason number ones and looked really great to start the year, They had quite a tough April and early May, losing a series in Tennessee and then getting swept by their old foes in Oklahoma in a 3-game series. In the SEC tournament to start postseason play, they were destroyed 14-2 by Texas A&M. And then in the postseason, the Women's College World Series playoffs, the Super Regionals, they lost the first game to Clemson in Austin and were tied in game 2 all the way through the 10th inning when Katie Bennett finally connected on a sacrifice fly to score the go-ahead run, which gave Texas a 7-5 win to keep them alive, to force a game 3 where they barely eked out a 6-5 victory over the Clemson Tigers to return to the Women's College World Series. All season long, though, whenever they've been in trouble or faced adversity, the team kept coming back to a motto: fuel the fire. This motto became the team's rallying cry and foundation during a pickleball-fueled fall retreat when, according to ESPN, 5 of the senior leaders created a Fuel the Fire PowerPoint to show the team what was most important to their culture this season. It was this message they had was particularly centered around empowering underclassmen and kind of breaking down this wall between the upperclassmen and the underclassmen and making sure they were all on the same level, and also talking about their resiliency and ability to come together when times got tough. According to the players, every time things got bad, they went back to those 3 words: fuel the fire, and they got things back on track. So, Alex, I ask, what is the fuel to your fire?
The fuel to my fire is thinking about college softball and its intersection with college sports business. Very late on Friday, a federal judge finally approved a settlement that is going to drastically change how college sports operates. The House settlement, as it's known, caps several years of negotiations between the athlete plaintiffs and the NCAA over not just what former players are owed for being denied a chance to earn outside money while they played sports, but it sets out an arrangement for schools for the first time to directly pay their athletes above the table. Starting this fall sports season, it'll be $20.5 million per year, with the amount likely going up over the years. That same Friday night of that settlement being approved, Texas beat Texas Tech to win the Women's College World Series. Hook 'em, congrats to the Horns. First Women's College World Series title for them. But on the mound for the losers, Texas Tech, was NiJaree Canady, the best player in the country. I want to talk about the Red Raiders for a moment. Canady had already been a USA Softball Player of the Year at Stanford, but the Red Raiders wooed her with a nice chunk of change via the transfer portal. Texas Tech's NIL Collective, its third-party group that pays athletes there, and does so quite effectively, I should say, was key in paying Canady $1,050,024 this season. Canady was delightfully transparent with reporters about the exact numbers. $1 million to play, $50,000 for moving expenses, and $24 because that is her jersey number, as she explained. Canady pitched almost every inning of the WCWS until Texas really hit her hard in the first inning of the decisive Game 3 of the title series. The 5 runs that Canady allowed that inning raised her ERA all the way up to a dreadful 1.11. I thought this intersection of events on Friday was interesting. Canady is a huge star, and she got paid like one, and her presence really was the driving factor that turned Texas Tech from a middling program, in fact, just 2 years ago, last place program in the Big 12, into a title contender. The ROI on that $1 million for the Texas Tech third-party collective was incredible, and Canady gets to get paid and have a real star turn at the biggest showcase event for her sport. And it made me wonder about other programs under this coming House settlement. Even the top programs in softball only spend 7 figures a year, all expenses included, most of those not on players specifically, on the sport. And it's clear that $1 million in the regime of the last few years in college sports would get you maybe a decent backup quarterback in Tech's conference, the Big 12, But in softball, it got the Red Raiders the most dynamic star in the sport, who totally changed the fortunes of the program. I can think of a lot of athletic departments going forward that are going to take that $20.5 million and give almost all of it to football, spreading the rest around their Olympic sports, their basketball, just a little bit each. But softball is a rising boat. The ratings are great. The attendance at the Women's College World Series is great. And as Ben and Lindsay just discussed in that excellent interview, it's got, the backing of real professional investors, organizations who really seem to believe in the future of this sport. So my thought is, why not spend, $3 million of your $20.5 million and try to be the next Texas Tech softball, especially if you are not a football contender anyway, and the marginal expenditure that you would make on the house settlement is the difference between going 6-6 and 7-5. But there is a potential fly in this ointment. Now, everything outside of the $20.5 million that any third-party collective, like the ones that have run the sports economics for the last few years, pay to players going forward, is supposed to be what people would call real NIL deals. That's real deals that are based on a player's name, image, and likeness, their commercial popularity, their marketing value. That's always been nominally what these deals have been supposed to be, but we are all adults here, and we understand that the vast majority of agreements that have been struck up by collectives the past 3 or 4 years have only been the most thinly veiled attempts to pay athletes directly in exchange for playing at a school. You've never heard of the backup offensive lineman who got paid $750,000 last year. That's not why he is being paid to show up in commercials. He's being paid to be on the team, for example. And this settlement provides for a, quote, clearinghouse, that's what they're calling it, at Deloitte, the big consultancy and auditor, that says that its job will be to look at deals that are submitted not by the schools themselves, but by these third-party collectives that will still exist, and make sure that these agreements are truly commercial in nature. In other words, the clearinghouse is going to be tasked with stopping deals exactly like the one that Canady signed with Texas Tech before this season. And if the settlement works, there really won't be able to be future Canadys who are paid by outside groups in the amount that she was paid. It will be time for athletic departments to make tough decisions, and it does seem likely that the top female earners, the rare few of them, including Canady, will be hurt by this deal, because the outside groups won't just be able to pay them whatever they can fundraise to bring them onto these rosters at their favorite schools. So as college sports prepares for this new era, it's worth recognizing a few things. A step forward in general will take away some critical gains that some athletes, in particular the most elite women, have made the past few years, but also that it's really good to get things in writing ahead of time. And Canady and her agent already struck up her new 7-figure deal for next year with Texas Tech's outside NIL collective. And all I have to say about that is that while there is an effective date for the settlement, and it's this upcoming season, there is no effective date for savvy business dealings. That's all for this episode. We also have a special bonus show that is in the podcast feeds right now for our treasured Slate Plus members. It's about outfield defense, how it's measured, how it's contributed to a heightened understanding of one great player this year in particular. Cubs fans, that's right, it's for you. It's about Pete Crow Armstrong. To hear that, you can subscribe to Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangup plus to get access wherever you listen. The episode is available right now, and we will see you there. Our show notes are at slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to follow the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Our producer is Kevin Bendis, and for Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs, I'm Alex Kirshner. Remember Zelma Beatty, and thanks for listening.